Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Rappin with ReefBum. I'm your host, Keith Berkelhamer, and we got a few folks that have joined us tonight. Thanks everybody for tuning into the live stream. Great Bearded Reef is back with us again. Absolute Carrot and Dmitry Tumanov. Thanks, Dmitry, for tuning in once again. Rick G, I see, Planet 3D, Calypso's Reef, and all these other folks tuning in. So thank you everybody. Well, tonight we got another great show in store, and it is my pleasure to welcome Greg Hiller. Greg has been active in the reef keeping hobby since 1996. He has raised several species of marine fish and propagated dozens of species of soft and hard corals. He actually has a few SPS corals named after him. The Aqua Delight is one of my personal favorites. Greg is a founding member of the Boston Reefer Society, BRS, and is a frequent monthly meeting speaker helping to educate and contribute to the success of many Boston area hobbyists. Greg holds a PhD in biochemical engineering from UC Berkeley, which he believes has contributed to his success in the reef keeping hobby. Greg has also authored a number of articles for online hobbyist publications, most dealing with chemistry aspects of the hobby. He currently works for a major biotechnology company in the bioreactor process development group. Greg really focuses on the scientific and bioengineering part of the hobby, so that's really an interesting perspective, and I'm really excited to have you, Greg, and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Keith. Great to be here.
Digging that shirt there. Science will win.
That's right. Pfizer, vaccine's coming, man. Hold your breath.
Any inside poop on that?
Well, it's all public information, but it looks like the vaccine may be here. Well, they'll have a readout on the efficacy within a few weeks, probably. It all depends upon how many people get sick in the placebo arm, really.
Well, fingers crossed that something will happen, whether it's with Pfizer or another company.
Yep.
And yeah, the sooner the better.
As many shots on both, so somebody will probably.
Yep. There you go. But no, listen, Greg, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate this. I know you were hustling back home to get onto the live stream, and you made it in the nick of time. But,
yeah, I was hang gliding.
You were hang gliding? Seriously?
Yes, it was.
Cool. I've never tried that, and I don't think I ever will.
It's fun. It's fun.
So one thing, Greg, I didn't mention in your bio was that many years ago in the early days of reef keeping, you used CompuServe's FishNet forum as a troubleshooting resource, and this helped you achieve, and I'm quoting here from your Reef Keeping magazine bio, such rapid coral growth in his tanks that he needed to learn and develop techniques of coral propagation / fragmentation. So can you kind of delve into that a little bit in terms of the early days in CompuServe's FishNet forum and how that helped you?
Sure. So, I mean, it was really amazing, in the early days of the internet when it was actually first functioning, and I went online and started meeting all these people, and I was amazed that, it was a lot of the people that were writing the books in the day and had fantastic knowledge, Julian Sprung, Charles Delbeek was there, Greg Scheimer, Mike Paletta, and then at one point in time, I met somebody by the name of Randy, and I realized he probably lived close to me, and I read some of his posts, and I thought to myself, God, this guy sounds like he has a PhD in chemistry. And then eventually I realized he lived in the Boston area, and I said, hey, I'd like to come over and see you sitting, and we struck up a great friendship. So that was Randy Holmes Farley, and then I realized, yeah, he does in fact have a PhD in chemistry. So yeah, we've been part of the hobby for a long time in the Boston area. He lives in the Arlington area.
So is that kind of like how you got to start in the hobby in terms of the CompuServe days, or was there another story before that kind of got you jazzed about it?
Yeah, it comes down to, we moved into a new house, and it was like 93, and actually it was 94, I guess. And we had a fair amount of space. Yeah, we didn't have hardly any furniture because I just got out of graduate school practically. And we had some large stretches along the wall, and I said to my wife, look, we could put a fish tank along this wall. I had freshwater fish for many years, and they did really well. And she said, well, yeah, but freshwater fish are ugly, she said. So I said, huh, all right, yeah, I always thought about doing saltwater, but never did. And so I figured I'd just start reading up on it. And that's really, and then I first set up a tank that was, kind of the classic 1970s fish only system with all these bleached corals, and just sand. And it was, it was pleasant, but algae grew on everything quickly. There was nothing you could do about that. And it just seemed,
You always had to bleach the corals, right, to get the algae out.
yeah, you would
right?
bleach the corals and re-clean everything, and the fish were always kind of sick and they didn't feel very good, and it was just kind of fighting nature the whole time. And that's when I set up a 65-gallon reef tank with we went down to Florida and picked up some live rock. I think it was probably Indo-Pacific live rock. And we set up a tank and we put that live rock in, and I just could not believe all the things growing on that live rock. Just, all these barnacles going at it and filter feeding organisms, and things were cruising around on the rock everywhere. And it turns out we, of course, had a mantis shrimp, as a lot of people did back those days, which we had to eventually get out. But it was just so fascinating to go down and look at that system with so much life in it, compared to, the fish only system with all those bleached corals and fish that just weren't feeling well. So I slowly converted that fish system to a reef system, and then put really bright lights over it. And it was, and then it started, it was an acrylic tank, and it started to crack at the top.
Oof.
I was like, oh no, this is like rush to go get another tank. So it was, it didn't crack all the way, but we had to rush around to do some of this stuff, which was not optimal. And in the long run, I transferred everything. I mean, that slowly became a reef system, and stuff was growing to the surface. So we eventually bought an 8 foot by 6 foot by 30-inch high system, and set that up and did it, more carefully that time, and then transferred everything over to that system and got everything established. And that system has done very well. It's had a few setbacks, but it's done extremely well.
And now Greg was also kind enough to shoot some video of his tanks, and we're gonna take a look at that and talk about it. But Greg, I wanted to talk about one thing you mentioned, which is when you first got the reef tank and you got live rock and went down to Florida and you had all these little critters and microorganisms and what have you, and it's interesting today. I would say most likely the majority of people that are starting tanks are starting with dry rock, and I did that once. The viewers know I've talked about this. I've been in reef keeping for 25 plus years myself, and I've always started my tanks with live rock. 5 years ago, I started a tank with dry rock for the first time, and I just had one problem after another, and I ended up rebooting the tank after 2 years because I just got frustrated with the slow process and all the the bad stuff that came along with the dry rock in terms of the algae and the dinos and you name it, bacterial blooms. I had it, but I just started another tank, a 225-gallon Peninsula tank, and I started that with live rock, and I got it shipped in water from up from Florida. And
Tampa Bay? Was that Tampa Bay saltwater?
No, it was TB Aquatics.
Okay.
And so the tank cycled in about a week. It's got feather dusters on it. It's got little. I did have a mantis shrimp in there, but what I did was I soaked the rock on 3 different occasions for like a minute in very high salinity salt water to kind of flush out those critters. So I had a whole bunch of pistol shrimp and the mantis shrimp and some bristle starfish, which I kept, but I didn't kill all the other critters that I didn't put back in my tank. I took them to a local fish store. I donated them, but I just wanted to speak to that in terms of how I think it's really so cool to start a tank with live rock. I know it's tough to get these days, but the majority of people do start tanks with dry rock. What are your thoughts on starting a tank with dry rock versus live rock?
So absolutely, with dry rock is perfectly fine, and so my 400-gallon system, it was mostly dry rock, but you just got to be more patient. So, but the important thing, of course, is to seed that with good things from other tanks. to get the sponges in there and all the filter feeding critters, and generally they propagate along. So I've only ever bought probably 40 pounds of dry rock in all that time. That was in the 65-gallon system many years ago, and I had no idea what rocks pieces anymore were live rock or anything like that. But the dry rock in my big 400-gallon system is loaded with sponges and all kinds of critters. So, it's just a question. I think everything kind of ends up at a certain place. If you start with live rock or you start with dead rock, in time, a lot of the things on live rock just won't survive long term. They were exciting to look at when I was first starting out, and that was fun. But a lot of those things will decline, and a lot of the things on the dry rock will kind of end up encrusting, and eventually you kind of end up almost at the same place in the long run, because there's just things that we don't provide in our systems, unless you're like squirting microalgae in all the time and trying to add marine snow or something like that. I think a lot of that stuff is it's just not gonna survive long term. It's just so hard because we just don't have infinite amounts of water and
Right. So we have more folks tuning in, and please, everybody, feel free to pipe in with some questions. This is a great opportunity to to have a conversation here with Greg, and I got plenty of questions myself, and we'd like to encourage you guys, putting some comments in the chat section. Retro Reefs is saying, Greg, that tell Greg my reef mentor Bob Stark has great things to say about him.
Great. So, one more thing I'd like to say about the whole live rock versus, dead rock systems. If you get really good live rock, sometimes as I recall, actually, I had a fair amount of trouble with cyanobacteria and things like that, because what would happen is there would be clams and really large organisms that were encrusted or just part of the rock, and they would die, and then they would release all these nutrients, and you'd have growths around them. So, there's good and there's bad about that. If you've had the dry rock for long enough and everything has kind of come to some equilibrium, that's one thing. But when things are big in there and they long term just won't survive and then they die, that's not good. Or if you have some kind of, you had yours moved in water, and that's great. But if not, and you have a bunch of sponge die, whenever you add nutrients to the water, it's just a bad scene.
Yeah. No, it definitely makes it tough, and I think one of the big pluses that people think with dry rock, well, one is that you could really sculpt a pretty interesting aquascape out of the water. You could take your time doing that. Where live rock, you really can't do that. And then there's other things with dry rock, and people say that it's great because it comes without pests and all that stuff, and that's true. But when I did start my dry rock only tank, I eventually did get pests because they did hitchhike in on some of the base of corals in terms of rock and the
Right.
coral skeleton. So it's not a complete 100% guarantee you're not going to have pests with a dry rock only tank you start. But yeah,
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, there's stuff will come in from all kinds of ways, and in reality, if you're going to have a natural tank, many forms of algae are going to come in, and you're just going to have to find a way to deal with those one way or another. So, I feel like Bologna is just inevitability. It's going to come in on something, and there's not much you're going to be do about that. But I've had actually very good luck. So I've had a lot of problems with Bryopsis in my big system. And then I had an anemone die a few years ago, and that added a lot of nutrients to the system. But in the long run, I found that these big urchins would really, grind away at that, and made a huge difference in the long run. So one thing I haven't mentioned a while. So there was a time when I was propagating the Magnifica anemones. And so I had some split naturally on me, and then in a few cases, I actually sliced them open because one had come onto the glass, and I was like, well,
Whoa.
it's kind of inviting me to slice it up right if it's right on the glass. And I did that a few times, and a few times successfully. But eventually, I added another large anemone. Randy Holmes Farley was getting rid of his really big, large teal carpet anemone. And I took that from him, and I don't know if this is. I've heard people say this before: 2 anemones in a tank that are not the same one don't necessarily get along. And in the long run, the Magnifica declined, and then it finally moved down into the rock work. And I thought, well, maybe it'll come back out, but yeah, no, it just eventually just disintegrated there and then distributed all of its nutrients into the water, which is just not a good thing. Not a good thing.
Do you recommend adding an anemone to a tank kind of like at the beginning? You know, if you add an anemone to a tank with chock full of corals, it could move around and sting some stuff. Is that, or you just kind of have to roll the dice with those things and keep your fingers crossed?
You have to roll the dice. You have to roll the dice. I mean, you know, you have to decide what's the important critter in your tank, right? For any of these things, you have to say, well, this is really important to me and this is not so much. I mean, you know, most SPS corals will grow back. You know, and if an anemone burns a little bit here and it burns a little bit there, it usually doesn't cause a catastrophe. You know, and sometimes if you really like one coral, it's safer to have it in a few different spots in the tank, at least a fragment or two, on the chance that it's, you know, coral disease is a lot of times they start on one colony. And for some reason, they just move across that colony. Sometimes it's a biofilm of critters that just kind of keep working their way across it. But if you have a fragment in a different spot in the tank, sometimes it will not jump. You know, if there's something really wrong with the tank, you know, all kinds of things can happen. But if it's just a little frag, one that's just isolated, just not even touching it, you know, can be far enough away that it will survive just fine. And the colonies will regrow. I mean, I've had colonies regrow many, many times over the years. And, you know, my 400-gallon system, you know, it's in several cases, it's grown really to the surface, right? And when it grows to the surface, it starts, you know, spreading out. It starts forming a little atoll, quite frankly. And it's dead on the top. You know, it forms this red, funky kind of filament, this red turf algae on the top. Sometimes the hermit crabs like to crawl up there and just hang out in the sun, I guess.
Getting a little suntan.
But it's long term. It's, you know, there's not much alive on there. So eventually, every few years, if you have a successful, you know, SPS tank that's brightly lit, you really have to go in and just break everything up. I have a video. I'm not sure if I ever posted it, but 2 Christmases ago, I basically chopped the top 1/3 of my tank off. And I went in there with screwdrivers and I had a brass hammer and I was just whacking at chunks because it's, you know, other than the top surface, a reef is largely dead, right? It's just the top surface that's touching the sun that's really growing. So eventually, you know, if you have a tank that's growing, you have to break that stuff back and break the top off and then put a few new frags and reorient. You know, one of the things that you were talking about earlier as far as aquascaping a tank, you know, there's only so much you can do. And once the colonies start growing, that structure is just going to take off on its own. And so you can create the most fantastic aquascape ever, but the corals are going to control that in the long run. And if you look at my system, it's a little wild. Like my corals are kind of growing into each other and on each other, and I just kind of let things go.
Yeah, no, Greg, you bring up a bunch of good points, and I wanted to talk about those. You know, I wanted to show the video and talk about them, but you're kind of bringing them up right now. That you know, and yeah, I think that's vitally important in terms of sometimes it's kind of tough to go in there with like whatever you're using, a screwdriver or a fragging tool, and sometimes it's tough to like, wow, this is a very mature reef. It looks awesome, but you know, you got to do what you got to do because the tank will choke itself out. If you don't clear it out and give corals some room to grow and also increase the circulation in the tank, or else it'll just you know, suffocate everything. And
exactly right. You hit on it. Circulation in the tank is key. If you let things go too far and you just don't keep increasing that circulation, you get into trouble. Yeah, for sure.
And you know, and in terms of aquascaping, I've every time I've started a reef tank, I've gotten better in terms of the amount of rock that I use. I mean, when I first got into the hobby, you know, I think the rule of thumb was 2 pounds of live rock for every gallon of water. And, you know, I've gone down to like about 1 pound for, you know, every gallon of water. And you know, yeah, it's a more of a minimalist type of look, but if you do it right and the corals are happy and growing, then yeah, that cool aquascape is going to just get covered up anyway.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It'll fill in however it fills in, you know. And I talked about breaking things back, you know. I've had trouble getting calcium reactor substrate of lately, and Reborn just seems to be gone, and I'm not really happy with the other ones. So I've just taken all the old skeletons I've got and breaking them up, and a lot of them I've bleached out over the years and just, you know, rinse them a few times. And now I'm using just old Montipora and Nacropora skeletons and just smashing them all up and tossing them into the top of my calcium reactor. And it's worked just fine.
It's the circle of life, right?
It's a circle, yeah. It's absolutely. I'm recycle. It's recycle day. I just toss them all back in the calcium reactor.
So, Greg, we got a bunch of questions and some specific to the live rock discussion we were just talking about before. Jim Carson is asking, could you take dry rock, put it in a lobster cage, and then fish it out at the end of the lobster season? Would that work? He lives in a place where the water is colder.
No, it won't work. Well, it might work kind of, but the problem is you'll probably end up with a lot of organisms that are temperate, and unless you plan to keep a temperate tank, when you crank the temperature up to 75 and towards 80, they'll die, and then they'll release nutrients that you don't want. So I mean, unless it was really dense rock and you're just trying to get coralline algae on it, and I don't think that really accomplishes very much. So no, you really want to have, if you're shooting for a tropical tank, you need tropical waters.
Yeah, that makes sense. Matt Greer is asking, says, I'm starting a 180 as we speak with about 60 pounds of old Fiji rock. I've added about 100 pounds of cured dry rock. How long do you think I'll be waiting until I can add my acros?
You know, it all depends. I think if you get some, I can't remember if there was some actual live rock or something from another tank. Yeah, I guess the cured live rock. You know, a few months, I would say, is probably a good idea. The best thing is, so when I set my new system up and moved stuff over, I actually moved kind of a few trial colonies first that were fairly hardy. And you'll be surprised sometimes, you know, even the super hardy stuff was not happy. Like I put a green slimer in there and the green slimer just died. So I was like, well, something's wrong if the green slimer doesn't live. So, you know, it just may take time. And I think it's best to test it with a few colonies first.
Yeah, no, that's always, you know, obviously if you have another tank and you've got some very hardy corals that you use as kind of canaries, so to speak, and starter corals and see what they do. Yeah, and that's usually the way to go. Greg, let's take a few minutes to look at the video you put together of your tanks and the equipment. You did a little narration, you know, over it. So it's about, I think it's a little over 6 minutes long.
Okay.
So we'll take a look at that, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about it. So let's roll the tape.
Okay.
Okay, we'll start with the Caliper farm. So this is an old 65-gallon all-glass tank that I drilled and turned into a Caliper farm. I'm using these really low-cost LED lights, and they do an amazing job. I mean, these things were incredibly cheap, but just a good tank for pulling nutrients out quickly. This is the sump system. It's a big stock tank. And there's a homemade calcium reactor that I've been using on the tank for about 11 years now. A fan above it to increase evaporation if I need to. I just use air conditioning on the room to pull additional moisture out of the room occasionally. And so this runs upstairs. There's two main pumps that will circulate water back up to the upstairs. I'm using an incredibly inexpensive temperature controller. It seems to work quite well, although I think I had to weatherproof the probe. And then I add DI water back with a peristaltic pump in the upper left-hand corner there. And there's some air pumps that add additional air to the skimmer through some wooden air stones. This is a small fragment garage tank that sits next to the big tank. Water just flows back into the stock tank via gravity. This is also using some very inexpensive but I guess more of a true reef lighting system, Ocean Revive. Incredibly powerful. I really was amazed. Some things don't do that well under it though. Some things don't encrust for some reason. I don't really understand that. This just gives you an idea. The zinnia is growing wild on the glass, but I cut that back and propagate it when I need to. Oh, and then just a touch again on the calcium reactor here. So again, it's homemade, just an acrylic cylinder with a pump, with an Eheim pump that recirculates water through it. This thing I fill about every 2 months, and then it dissolves about half of it in about 2 months. I used to use reborn substrate, but they haven't been able to supply it for many months now. So I've just gone to using old skeletons from the tank that have been bleached and then rinsed carefully. This is just a shot of the tank room in the morning before the artificial lights come on. This system is set up such that it gets a fair amount of light from the right-hand side in the morning and gets a fair amount of light coming in from the windows in the afternoon on the left-hand side. Also, there's the lighting system is on a rail that goes back and forth. It comes on every few hours and moves the system a few inches one way or another, just to minimize the point source of light and makes the corals potentially grow a little less towards the light. That's a teal carpet anemone that Randy Holmes Farley sold me many years ago. The purple tip acropora towards the right-hand side is Larry Jackson's. The other one is one I picked up not too long ago. Much brighter purple, moves further down the branch. The blue long branch stag in the back was from John Coppolino many years ago. The one right in the center is the Aqua Delight that I've had for many years. Lost the colony and then recently got it back with a frag a couple years ago. I've had problems with bryopsis in this tank for a long time, but of late I have some very large urchins that seem to be doing a pretty good job with both the bryopsis and Valonia. This is a shot from the very left-hand side of the tank. This is a shot from inside the canopy. So there's a pair of 400 watt metal halides and then 3 250 watt Phoenix double end 14K bulbs on either side there. And a buddy of mine made this this kind of canopy for the system, and it just has these little guillotine type things that pull out, and so it allows me to get down into the tank very effectively. This is a 37 gallon tank that I've had for many years. At one point in time I had seahorses in it. I was breeding seahorses for a while, and I had pipefish. And then I had an octopus for a while, and then I had some cuttlefish in the system. But now it's more just a low flow kind of LPS system, and this one actually does have an LED system on it.
And we are back. Wow, Greg, That's one heck of a system. So what's the coolest thing you ever saw in your system?
Yeah, so this was back when I had I think I converted the fish only system into a reef system, and it must have come in on some live rock some point in time. And again, I never really bought that much live rock, but one day at night I was working in the system, and I was had my hands down in there, and it was, the lights were off in the room and the tank lights were off, and I brushed up against something, and it lit up blue.
Blue.
It lit up blue, and I was like,
what the heck is that?
Is that? I mean, it created its own light. And
wow.
And then over time, I figured out what it was. It was some type of, I think it was a serpent star, some type of serpent star.
So bioluminescence or something?
Yeah, bioluminescence. And I specifically remember when my kids were young, I would have, babysitters would come over, and at the end of the night, I'd say, hey, come here, let's see this. And I would take an acrylic, rod and poke it. And what was cool is you touched it, and the senses, the kind of the nerve endings would propagate along. So this electric blue light would propagate along its arms and then out the other arms. It was the coolest damn thing I'd ever seen.
Wow! So you could actually spur it on to make that.
Exactly.
Wow, that is really
just tap
cool.
it and it would light up.
Wow. So we got a lot to talk about in terms of that system there, Greg, and it's a very it's a very basic system. It's not a it's not a complicated system. It's just I'm going to say it's an old school type of system where you've got some nutrient exports with that caloriform going on there, and you got a calcium reactor. I didn't see a protein skimmer. Are you using?
There is one.
There's a protein skimmer in there. Okay, and you've got that basic sump, and I mean it just really proves that you can have success in this hobby without investing a lot of money and having the latest and the greatest in terms of the fancy equipment.
Yeah, keep it simple, stupid. It really is really important. The basics, you just got to realize any food you put in has to come out somewhere, right? This is a closed system. Either you're going to do it with water changes, which is an extremely slow way of doing it, a very expensive way, or you're going to grow things, which is one of the best ways, right? Get xenia growing, get some soft corals growing, or even hard corals if they grow fast. All those things are pulling nutrients out of the water.
Right.
And then calorpa as well can help you, and then a decent protein skimmer, because you really want good air exchange so that you don't end up with some kind of crazy pH because of too much carbon dioxide coming in, maybe from your calcium reactor, or just too much carbon dioxide in the room, for instance. That can be a problem, So, but I do feel like a skimmer is pretty important just to kind of keep the balance of the gases in the system.
Do you check your parameters often? And if you do, what are your nitrates and phosphate? No testing.
Well,
you're just looking at the tank and.
Well, yeah, that's really important. Look at the tank for sure. For instance, the other night it got really warm here in Boston. I was like, why do things look weird? And then I'd been out the whole day, and I got home. I was hang gliding again. I got home. I was like, why do things look bad? And I went downstairs. Sure enough, it was 84. Which, sometimes in the summer I'll let it slowly drift up to 83, 84, and that's okay. But suddenly you get up to 84. You don't want that. So with respect to testing, I do test one thing extremely often, and that's just the alkalinity.
Yeah.
Okay. So you can make your own alkalinity test kit super easy if you just use a pH indicator and a little bit of acid. And so I made liters of the stuff, and so I can test it very, very frequently, and I do. And that generally, if you test for alkalinity and you're using a calcium reactor, then the calcium is usually exactly in the right spot. So, I might test for calcium once every 3 months or so, and for magnesium once every 6 months or so anymore. But really, just making sure that the alkalinity is in the right spot all the time is super important. That's what I found.
Yeah, no, for sure. Do you keep track of your pH? I had Adam from Battle Corals on last week's show, and he was talking about how he thought that the higher pH that he was able to achieve recently has really helped his corals. That's not something you monitor. And could you address could you address that with your background in terms of the biochemistry of all that stuff? In terms of, do you think higher pH would?
Yeah, I mean, the natural reef has a somewhat higher pH than my system for sure runs. So you can balance that by keeping alkalinity high, right? And so I do. My alkalinity is probably slightly higher than natural seawater, but that allows my pH to be a little bit lower because I'm using a calcium reactor, and that's okay. And the tragic thing is that doesn't work in the natural environment, right? So unfortunately, and here's my science coming into this, and everybody, this is all facts, and there's no BS on this. You can go and you can look at the testing of the carbon dioxide level off the coast of Hawaii. They do it every year, and it oscillates, but it is going up, and it's now crossed 400 parts per million, and you can see the clear trend line. And what that means is the pH in the ocean has already dropped 0.1 pH units. Okay, that's a lot. You think the entire ocean's dropped 0.1 pH, and corals don't like that, and they're unhappy about that. And you could say, well, wait, the pH in my tank is 8.0. Why am your corals are not happy? Your corals are fine because you can artificially elevate the alkalinity. And then people say, well, why can't we do that in the ocean? Well, yeah, you could. You could go mine the White Cliffs of Dover and build this ginormous fleet of boats that like sprinkle it out on the surface of the water all over the. It's just completely impractical. Controlling the level of carbon dioxide is what you need to do, and I hope that, not to be political, but I hope that the current believed to be president-elect will get on the bandwagon and really turn us around, because this can't go on. All the scientifics are, everyone's understands that.
I agree with you, and yes, we don't want to make this a political show, but I am encouraged by the change in direction in terms of the climate change, perspective from the incoming president-elect. So we got a couple more questions here, Greg. Robert Poorman asks, love the stream. Thanks, Robert. Any thoughts on using a sump that has a deep sand bed with a plenum? I'm back after 15 years with a 1-year-old tank. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that anyone ever really proved the value of a plenum. I just don't think it's necessary. I wouldn't bother with it. I like the look of sand at the bottom of my tank. A lot of people have gone with the bare look now. I don't think it really matters. If you put sand in there, nutrients can accumulate, but I don't think it's the end of the world. I think eventually it reaches some equilibrium as well. And sand will dissolve to some extent and stabilize the alkalinity a little bit. But in any tank that's really using a lot of calcium, you have to have a calcium reactor. So I don't see any value in going back to the old days of plenum. I'm not sure it was ever really proven all that much.
So, Greg, you mentioned sand beds and bare bottoms. What I couldn't even tell with your tank and your display. I'm assuming you've got a sand bed there, but it was all covered up with corals. But
yeah, there's a sand bed there, but again, things keep growing out, and eventually, the Montipora will grow just on the surface of the sand, and they'll move out, and they get to the glass, and they start growing up the glass. Incidentally, don't let them do that. Don't let them do that very much, because my 65-gallon tank, I let stuff grow way too far, at least hard coral. And when I broke it back, the glass was clearly had a film on it. You could never remove that film. I mean, maybe you could grind it off, but in a practical manner, you could never remove it. I've let like green star polyps grow all over the glass, and that's really beautiful. I don't think that causes a problem. But a hard coral like Montipora, it'll grow on, it'll just completely cover the glass, and it's not a good idea.
Are you actively trying to remove detritus from your systems at all, or are you just kind of letting nature take its course? And
no, I haven't. I don't. Not in the main system. I mean, in the sump, I'll vacuum debris off the sump occasionally, just because I don't want it to get stirred up if I pour water in there or something like that. And in my 65-gallon system that's attached to it, where I grow the caulerpa, a lot of stuff settles out there, and you get kind of this mulm layer. And so I'll vacuum that up occasionally, but I'm never super rigid. And when I do that, I just kind of look at stuff and I just siphon some of it out once in a while.
Have you ever experienced old tank syndrome? After a number of years, all of a sudden things kind of go downhill, or what do you think about old tank syndrome? Do you think that's a real thing?
To an extent, I think it's just a question of balancing the nutrients. I think that the nutrients get too high, and I've had times when my tank wasn't doing very well, and I think it's just a question of sometimes corals fight, and then sometimes even some corals won't just do well in a system, and I've had times when I knew one colony died back, and I got a fragment from someone that I knew was the same coral, put it in there a few months later, and it wouldn't grow, and it died, and waited another year, put it in, and it wouldn't grow, and 2 more years later, put it in, and grows up again. No problem.
There you go.
So, there's a lot of mystery,
There's a lot of variables,
Yeah, you can't understand it all, but, live and let live, and just I don't get too worked up over it. But I think that old tank syndrome is largely just due to nutrient levels. I think you're just not enough flow, like you said before. Things get too big, not enough flow, and maybe not taking care of things as well as you could. Cleaning the skimmer more frequently, vacuuming this and that, and just making sure that you have good nutrient control, and checking things like calcium and alkalinity and salinity and magnesium that you might not have, or maybe some of your standards or something drifted and you weren't being very careful. Maybe some of the instruments you were using were drifted.
What are your thoughts in terms of salinity for a reef tank? Do you think that natural seawater is a good target for salinity? Do you think it's better to have a higher salinity or a lower salinity?
Definitely not higher. I think you can go a little bit lower and save a little bit of money on salt water. I don't think it hurts anything. Natural reefs, you have the Red Sea is much higher level of salinity. Well, not much, but somewhat higher level of salinity at other places in the world. And corals survive even occasionally when, fresh water is coming into some area or another, not full fresh water, but just, somewhat lower. So corals can survive that, but I would not go, much below 1.021, I think. I can't remember. Natural seawater is like 2.5, I think. 1.0225, yeah.
Yeah. So we got a question from Great Bearded Reef, and this is actually a question for the both of us. Top 3 for keeping and growing successful colonies of SPS. And he's saying with a question mark, stable DKH, flow, and light. What do you think, top 3?
What was the first part of the question?
Basically, what are the top 3 things for keeping and growing successful colonies at SPS? So if you had to give somebody advice, top 3.
Absolutely. Light, water motion, and alkalinity.
Yeah, I would say light is very important, stability, and keep a real keen eye on alkalinity, and stability.
Yeah, and I'm not a big proponent of well, I mean, you can feed your tank all kinds of stuff, and it may be that some SPS may eat some things. People have shown, the polyp is eating something. I don't really worry about that. I don't really try to feed. I feed my fish, and there's enough nutrients in the system that generally is enough. Mostly, I feed the corals light.
Right. So do you use like any amino acids or anything, coral foods, or you're just basically using the fish food and letting the fish poop do its thing?
Exactly. And it doesn't take much either. So I don't use amino acids. I mean, I'm not opposed to the idea that you might achieve something by that, but amino acids, there's no significant natural level of amino acids in salt water. Just because they're so useful, most life would have already pulled them out of the salt water. So I don't think corals really need them. Now, the one thing that's kind of touches on that same thing is trace elements. And so, I think most trace elements are coming in with the calcium reactor skeletons you're breaking down. But I have found that in a system where things are growing quickly, I have had loss of color of colonies, particularly colorful Montipora and things like that are growing quickly. And so years ago, I did start using. I kind of created my own trace elements stuff in the lab, just pulled off a bunch of chemicals off the shelf, and I basically tried to create it based upon what was written originally on the old CombiSan trace elements. And unfortunately, CombiSan didn't really have that stuff in it. It was kind of just water, but it had a list that said it has this much, copper and this much barium and this much this and that. And so I mixed the stuff up, and that's kind of when I realized that CombiSan couldn't really have all that stuff in it because at least for me, I couldn't physically create one liquid that had all those things in it. I had to separate some of the components, otherwise they'd precipitate. And so I thought to myself, how can this have all these elements in it? There's something wrong here. And so, but anyhow, I just made it myself. And I'm not really careful about the way, I add a few capfuls of each every so often. Again, and this is true for kind of the work that I do for cells in culture. I feel like there's a pretty wide range of certain things that are just fine, for trace elements. And as long as you're in that range, corals can pull out what they need. So, if you get too low, maybe there's a problem, but you add a little bit of something and it gets you back into that range. I think it's a pretty broad range for most things, most trace elements, not for calcium, alkalinity, and magnesium. Those really have to be, pretty close to the right range. And incidentally, one of the things that people talk about, alkalinity, and so for me, it's really important to be above that, that lower limit. And what I've never understand is people that say they have these horrible disasters when they have a spike in alkalinity. I've had my alkalinity go crazy high and almost never had a problem. I mean, it happens almost every time my carbon dioxide bottle starts running low because the regulator is not very good, and so it'll add a whole bunch of carbon dioxide and add a whole bunch of alkalinity in a short period of time. And I've never seen a real big disaster from that. So I'm always surprised when people say, "Oh, I had an alkalinity spike and it crashed my tank." I'm not sure I buy that. Usually, in most cases, I've found when I read online, someone says I had a tank crash, and they have some reason for it. And you're like, I'm not sure about that. And you ask them a series of questions, and eventually you get to the actual reason why their tank crashed, and it might be something, quite simple, like a heater broke.
Right.
And all kinds of crap went in from the heater.
Yeah.
That's another thing I feel strongly about. Be very careful about things like glass heaters.
Titanium's the way to go.
Try to keep the cord, the cord out, and don't break it or use a metal one and have it on a controller. High heat is a really bad thing for a tank, but also just if a heater breaks, a glass thing breaks, the chemicals that can be released from that, particularly if it's got some electricity behind it, really can be bad news for a system.
And you can get quite a jolt too there if you stick your hand in that tank, right?
Yeah. It's not a healthy place.
On multiple fronts, it's not a good thing. Greg, you were talking about trace elements, and a lot of people, out there do use GFO to help control nutrients. I don't know if that's anything you've ever done in the past. I'm going to assume you have not used a lot of GFO, but
well, I've experimented around it. I mean, I don't know how much it's actually doing. We bought a bunch, kind of a bulk supply of it once, and I sprinkle it in. I mix it with carbon, and I just put it in kind of a cylindrical thing and let water trickle over that whole mess. But you got to be careful with that GFO. If you just pack it all in something and it's not circulating, it'll just become frozen because the alkalinity kind of seals it up. But if I sprinkle it in with carbon, as I put activated carbon in, that seems to work. But I don't know I'm not really sure it's really doing all that much for me. I don't. I mean, again, I have a whole bunch of it, so I just keep putting it in, and when it's gone, I'm not sure I'll bother to buy anymore.
Do you think I mean, one of the negative, my perspective is that one of the negatives about using GFO is that it can pull out valuable trace elements. Is that a true assumption?
I don't know. I haven't really looked into that. That maybe that's one of the reasons it made a difference. And I can't remember when I started using that and whether that was part of the problem. So much time goes by. I've kept pretty good notes. Years ago, I used to keep really good notes. More recently, I haven't kept those good notes, but I can't say that I've lined those things up in any manner.
So we've got a lot more questions, and I'm gonna back up to a question regarding Bioluminescence. You and I were talking about Bioluminescence during the video clip. You mentioned it briefly in terms of how you use the urchins to help beat that back. But Jay Lieberman is asking, did you ever try? And this is an interesting question because you have this chemistry background. Fluconazole for Bioluminescence. Have you ever tried any chemicals to try to beat back problematic algae like Bioluminescence?
I'm trying to think for any chemicals. Certainly not for Bioluminescence. I never try. I'm very. I mean, I'm a biochemical engineer. I know a lot about chemistry, and I'm just afraid to use complicated chemicals in a system like this, where it's killing something because it's probably killing other things too.
Right, that you don't know.
So I'm pretty reluctant, but at the same time, if it works and people are happy with it, and they feel like it hasn't killed a lot of other things, maybe that's okay. But I'm really reluctant to dump really, widespread. If you're trying to kill something locally and you think you can keep everything local, or just pull the rock out, But for me, the natural thing usually works the best. Get a big urchin and let it go in there and grind away. And it's beautiful too. These urchins, their spines are moving around. You brush against them and they do all kinds of crazy stuff. People come over and they're like, "Wow, that's an urchin! That's just so cool."
Are they hardy?
Some of them are really beautiful. Really beautiful.
Are they pretty hardy?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I've had them live for, I don't know, 5, maybe even 10 years for some of these urchins. More so than the ones that people specifically say for hair algae. I haven't had as much luck with those, like the tuxedo urchins and some of those. Those don't seem to do very well, and they don't seem to accomplish very much. But it's more the long-spined urchins. A lot of times people end up with a whole bunch of little urchins, on their live rock, and they don't want it grinding all the coralline away. And so sometimes you can find somebody that just wants to get rid of their urchins, and you say, "Oh, I'll take all your urchins, thanks."
Right? Yeah. Why not? Right? I mean,
Yeah.
Another question regarding chemistry. Activated carbon. Do you use that? Is that a good thing for a tank, or is that a bad thing?
I do, and I think it has significant value. Just because, I mean, you could go blue doing water changes to try to deal with all the substances that are being put out. So my tank is a mixed reef tank, right? So you saw some soft corals in there, gorgonians. There's a few mushrooms. There's all kinds of random stuff in there. And it all gets along, but it's all trying to poison each other as well, right? So if the water motion keeps things at least so that all those poisons are somewhat dilute and they're not too much localized, that helps. But then the stuff is still floating around, and it can make other things sick. So this might be part of the old tank syndrome type thing as well. So, activated carbon for sure pulls out organic compounds from the water. And there's no question your corals are putting out a lot of chemicals all the time, stuff that they just don't want, or stuff that they're trying to use to poison their neighbor with. So for sure, activated carbon can pull that out, and it's easy to use, and you can't go too wrong with it as long as you're using a decent quality stuff that's designed for aquarium that doesn't have a ton of phosphate that's going to leach out of it.
Yeah, I mean, I've always used activated carbon in my tanks, but I do know successful reefers that have not used it. So that's interesting, but that
yeah, I think it's one of these things where, for any of these things, if you have a really low density tank, like you have just a small number of fish and you have just a few isolated corals, yeah, you probably don't need it. And if you do a lot of water changes, but if that's not practical for you, you have a tank and there's corals just everywhere, and some of them probably don't get along. They're probably fighting each other with chemicals, and it's better to remove that. And tanks will get yellow as well. People you can test that too. You can like put a white plastic piece in the tank and just see as you move it away how yellow it gets, and you'd be surprised in some cases how yellow your water may be, and it'll take out those substances, the activated carbon well.
Right. Question from Dimitri, and this is a good question. How do you think the hobby has changed in the past 10 to 20 years, and where do you think it's going to be in another 10 to 20 years?
Yeah, really good question. So what has happened more recently, I think, is people are super into micro tanks, right? Smaller and smaller systems. And now with LED lights, everyone's super excited about LED lights. And I've had, my main system is still metal halide, but I'm using LEDs in other places and systems, and they work just fine. I'm not sure that in the long run that you can get kind of the penetration that you need to down deep into the water. But I really see this move towards small tanks, and then people just using these LED lights and turning them to a place that's just not natural. What I mean by that is I dive. I've been diving, all over the Pacific, and what happens when you dive is the red light gets filtered out pretty quick, and everything kind of becomes blue and then kind of grayish. But it doesn't become like Disneyland. It doesn't become like the electric light parade.
Yeah.
Corals just don't light up like these people have their systems. Reminds me of the 1970s with the black light posters. The kids would put the black light on. Ooh,
yeah.
That's not what a reef looks like.
Yeah.
They just don't look that way. And so, I mean, you can make things just look like the electric light parade, and that's my goal, is to have a natural system that looks like what I see when I dive. Although I don't want all brown, but when you dive, you see lots of beautiful colors.
Right.
And you won't have as many brown corals. There's nothing wrong with a few brown corals, right? I mean, I've had a colony of blue ridge coral, which is not blue. It's brown, right? Theoretically, it's a soft coral, but it makes it. But the skeleton is beautiful blue. And actually, when I broke up one part of my tank recently, I took all the old, stuff that was grown down before, and I broke it up. I'm gonna eventually turn it into polished jewelry, because why not?
That's awesome.
Because you can soak it in I think a little silicate material, and I'm gonna shape it into. I've already done some of it and put it in jewelry. I do silver jewelry work.
Man, Greg, you don't waste anything in that tank there, huh?
Yeah, recycle it all. Why not? I've had colonies that have died that were so beautiful. I figured, well, I can bring them in somewhere and sell them back to a shop to put in an old style 1970s fish only system, right?
Yeah, why not?
Why not?
We got a question from Great Bearded Reef, and this is an interesting question given your what we were just talking about in terms of testing. What do you think about ICP testing? Do you think that's a good idea for people to do? Do you believe in it? Do you think it's chasing too many numbers?
I think it's probably reasonably accurate for certain compounds. I mean, we use it in my work occasionally when we're trying to analyze for trace elements, particularly coming off stainless steel bioreactors and things like that. So there can be a use for it, but I don't know that. I don't think chasing numbers is a very good point. I don't think you need to analyze your tank up and down. I think you need to do water changes with a decent salt.
What would you?
Most things will take care of themselves.
What's your definition of a decent water change? What percent and how often?
Oh well, that all depends upon how concentrated the system is, right? How many corals and fish you've got in there. So, I mean, in my main system, I probably change 5% of the water once a month. That's probably about what I do. It's pretty rare that I actually do a water change for water change's sake. I just, pull off a bunch of water if I'm shipping corals or if I'm propagating stuff, and I work with that and then just throw that out afterwards because it's got slime and all kinds of stuff that's going off all the corals at that time. So I don't think you need to do a lot, but I don't know that unless you're trying to troubleshoot some particular problem with trace elements, I don't know that I would spend a lot of money on ICP analysis. That just seems like a lot of overkill to me.
Yep. So we have.
I've never sent a sample.
You never sent a sample out? Yeah.
Other than when years ago I wrote an article on calcium reactor substrates, and I dissolved some calcium reactor substrates and then diluted it and sent in some samples to find out what was actually in it. And it was actually quite accurate and quite nice to get that information. So that might be of interest if you're trying to look for a calcium reactor substrate that if you really knew what you wanted in it, right?
Let's. You just mentioned something that I wanted to talk about, and you were like one of the kind of like in the beginning in terms of putting together a calcium reactor, right? Weren't you involved with really one of the first calcium reactors that were put together for the hobby in terms of designing and
No.
I thought there was. I thought you had a connection.
No, I definitely was not. No, I was nowhere near the first. But some people showed me, what a you can see what a calcium reactor is. It's actually pretty darn simple, and so all you need is a cylinder, and it's great to have it clear so you can see how much is dissolved. But that's not absolutely necessary. But it's nice to see where the water level is and where the rock is. But no, it's a very simple system, and the calcium reactor that I have is a homemade. I mean, I've got the acrylic tube somewhere, and I kind of glued it to the base of something, and someone was using some white marine Tex, I think it was called. Somebody showed me that you could use that, and it doesn't make a really good seal, but if it's in your sump, it drips a little bit, no big deal. But you can make super simple calcium reactors. And all you really need is a decent pump to recirculate it. The Eheim pumps work extremely well. They'll work for decades, really. Yeah. Particularly in the calcium reactor because the pH is low, so no precipitation is occurring on the impeller in that case. It's just recirculating. pH is low because of the fact that you're dissolving stuff. And so the pump will run for almost forever, it seems like. Those little super efficient low energy Eheim pumps, just enough to recirculate the water around and then bubble carbon dioxide in. Calcium reactors are pretty simple.
Yeah, I've used calcium reactors for many years. Right now I'm using 2-part, but ESV 2-part, but I'm going to be using calcium reactor again, and yeah, they're really very efficient. What do you think about having a second chamber in a calcium reactor to help with the pH? Do you think that's necessary in terms of?
Well, I don't have one, so I don't think it's necessary. Yeah. I worried about that for a while, but again, I think you can compensate. So you can get into trouble, though. I think sometimes people would try to do that, and stuff would end up precipitating out, and so you wouldn't necessarily have quite as much as you hoped with respect to alkalinity. I think it's easier just to keep your alkalinity in the system just a slightly elevated all the time to compensate for the fact that the pH is a little bit lower due to your calcium reactor. So my calcium reactor. Here's one important thing for a calcium reactor that I found was really key to make it easier to operate, and that is tee off a line from a recirculation pump that has a fair amount of pressure behind it. That helps. So you're feeding into the calcium reactor under a little bit of pressure. That makes your life a lot easier with respect to controlling the calcium reactor.
What do you think about using a Kalkwasser in conjunction with a calcium reactor?
Yeah, absolutely. Nothing wrong with it, and it will help keep the pH a little bit higher. Just be careful though. Bad things can happen. I said that it's not that big of a deal if the alkalinity gets high, and that's true, except for the fact that if the alkalinity gets high, and then you compensate quickly for it. So, for instance, if I had a calcium reactor, the CO2 is going too much, it's putting too much alkalinity in, and the alkalinity goes really high, and then I realize it, and I go, oh, oh man, it's so high. Let me just turn all of the CO2 off right now. Okay, and what that does is you've got the alkalinity really high, and now you turn off the CO2, and now the pH goes high. And so high alkalinity, high pH snowstorm is coming.
Yeah.
And
Interesting.
snowstorm is not a huge deal for your tank, which can freak you out. You can come. I've gone into a system, looked at the system, and I'm like, it's just milky white, and you're like, oh my god, everything's dead. It's not. It's not actually. Things can survive that pretty well. You blow it off a little bit, and you clean the glass, and you go, oh, it's not actually quite as milky white as I thought. So things can survive that type of a thing. But the whole point is, what you don't want is a sudden change. So I think that if something goes wrong and the alkalinity gets really high, if you just immediately turn off the CO2, the pH is going to go high. If you taper off slowly, then the pH will drop slowly, and then it's more likely that the system will kind of rebalance it as that alkalinity gets pulled out again by the system. And the biggest problem with that is if you have that high alkalinity, high pH, you can also have precipitation that starts to occur on pumps. Particularly any place that's warm, that's where you get the calcium carbonate precipitation. And it's just really annoying if you have pumps that shut down. And incidentally, I have a very dim view of most submersible pumps. Years ago, it was the Rio pumps that would melt down and freeze up and kill tanks left and right. But the point in general is that I particularly favor external pumps that are, standard centrifugal pumps that are designed for the aquarium hobby. If you take care of those and once a year, ideally once a year, but maybe once every 2 or 3 years, you take them offline and you pull the thing out and then you clean them either with vinegar or hydrochloric acid or, diluted hydrochloric acid. That's really important. But the point is that high alkalinity and the high pH at the same time can cause precipitation on things, which is what really causes the problems.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems like there's been a big trend away from external pumps to submersible pumps in this hobby. I mean, when I started, it was pretty much I was always using an external pump to my sump. But now it's just I have a hard time finding a system that's using an external pump.
Well, I think power heads that are designed well, can be pretty good as long as you're careful with them and make sure that they don't seize up. And I'm all for creating motion right in the system, but at the same time, I really like the reliability. If you're going to use a return pump, I really like the reliability of an external centrifugal return pump that's plumbed, so that you can get to it and take it out. Those are just really powerful and really efficient.
So we have another chemistry question for you, Greg, and then we're gonna try to wrap this up because I don't want to keep you on all night long, even though we got a ton of questions going on here. So Saint Nova is asking, what does Greg think about lanthanum chloride safety over time in a reef tank? I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but
lanthanum chloride. Yeah, oh yeah. Well, I got a story on that. I would have to say I wouldn't do it anymore. So I did it, and I played around with it, and I think it's a mistake to use directly into your system. So, I mean, one thing that you could do, I suppose, is treat the water separately, but I don't even think I would do that anymore. So what it comes down to is I didn't see any significant negative effects for the vast majority of things in the tank, but I can never, ever keep a Tridac clam again. Okay. At one point in time, I had a Durasa that grew from, 3 inches to like 10 inches.
Yeah.
And to have a clam like that is a beautiful thing. It's really, really beautiful. And you have to do nothing for it. All they really need is light, at least if they're reasonably sized. But for some reason, and I assume this is the case, I used lanthanum, and then the Tridac clams that I had died, and I had read that might be a risk. And I just don't think it's necessary. You can control nutrients in other ways. But I just can't, and I thought maybe enough time would go by, and I've tried clams, again, I stopped using lanthanum like years ago, but there must be enough residue in the system somewhere that leaches out, I'm thinking, to kill the clams. Because I don't think there's anything wrong with my system other than that. I mean, I used to grow clams just fine. So that's got to be my assumption. Lanthanum and clams, not good.
All right, the last question is going to come from Robert Poorman. Is sodium carbonate better than bicarbonate for pH, and how much if used simultaneously?
It's a good question. So sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate are, in a sense, the same thing. Okay? But what I mean by that is, let's just say you took a glass of water and you put a little sodium bicarbonate in and you put a little carbonate in and you mix them up. Okay, short term, the one with the sodium bicarbonate will be a much lower pH and the sodium carbonate will be much higher pH. But if you let those just sit there, in time, carbon dioxide from the air will go into the carbonate, and carbon dioxide will flash off from the bicarbonate, and eventually you end up with the same thing. They're chemically the same thing. So it's just a question in the short run what you do. And so, if you want to short-term elevate pH, you can add carbonate instead of bicarbonate. But it doesn't really matter. Bicarbonate's a lot easier to come by. You just go buy Arm & Hammer or whatever, baking soda. Don't buy anything that has any kind of fragrance in it, good God. But, if it's cooking, if it's designed for cooking, it should be perfectly fine. And I think it's easier to add. It's easier to, it doesn't dissolve at quite as high concentration as the sodium carbonate, but I think it's fine to just use sodium bicarbonate. So they end up in the same place. It's just that the sodium bicarbonate flashes off additional carbon dioxide in time.
All right, Greg, man, listen, I'm not going to keep you any longer. Do you have any final thoughts for the folks out there watching tonight?
Keep it simple. You don't need, my tank has been successful for many years, and I've learned a lot of homemade ways to do stuff, and it doesn't really cost that much if you're careful about the things that you do. And you don't need the latest gizmo. Don't chase all the numbers other than the important ones. Alkalinity, temperature, pH. Well, not pH. Well, it's important, but it takes care of itself largely. Alkalinity, temperature, salinity has to be checked as well, but generally that's easy. Evaporate water, add fresh water back, right?
Do you use a controller?
For salinity? No. I use a level controller that just, the level in the sump drops. Oh, incidentally, so that's one thing I actually highly recommend as well. Never use a float switch. Those are a disaster.
Yeah, I agree.
Something's going to get on it. It's going to encrust. It'll get stuck. Yeah. But the air pressure monitors are extremely good. I've never had one fail, and I have multiple in use. They're extremely accurate, and they work well for years and years and years. And so I think they're called the Tsunami AT1 or something like that. I assume they're still for sale. I haven't bought one in years because I just don't need them anymore because they keep working. It's just a tube that you put in your sump at a certain level, and there's a little piece of tubing that goes to a sensor, and it's just extremely reliable because nothing's going to crawl up into that little airspace. And you can set them up to either turn on or off depending upon how you switch the leads, either turn on or off depending on the level. And they can be used for all kinds of things. And that's the way to keep track of your salinity. Other than, if you take 5 gallons of water off and water chicken, you got to add 5 gallons.
Yeah. All right, Greg. Well, listen, man. Thank you so much. If anybody's out there looking for some corals, hit Greg up. You have the website, right, Greg? That you sell corals on.
Yeah, I have a website that
little old school website.
It's really, really old. The best thing is if you're looking for something from me, look for me on the Boston Reefer Society. I post there quite frequently. Or you can send me an email directly. I don't ship a lot of stuff unless you've got your own FedEx account because I've gotten burned so many times. I'm willing to ship large orders if people really want a lot of stuff. The email that I generally use for that kind of stuff is corals with plural, at Greg Hiller, GregHiller.com.
Cool. All right. Well, listen, Greg. Again, thank you so much for being a guest, and I hope we can get you back, next year to talk some more. We didn't even talk about the fish breeding, the captive raised fish, and all that stuff. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff to talk about that I would love to. But thanks again. Appreciate it.
All right.
And just want to remind everybody that the next show will be next Sunday, November 15th at 7 p.m. Got another great guest. Sanjay Yoshi will be on the show talking, and he's going to be awesome, and looking forward to it. So until then, everybody be safe, be well, and we'll see you next time.
And science will win.
And science will win.
All right, Keith. Good talking to you.